Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. The desert evening in Las Vegas was soft and almost quiet, the way big cities never are back east. A thin man with gray hair and a careful, measured walk stepped out onto the driveway of his modest house, rolling a trash bin toward the curb. To the neighbors, he was just another retiree from New York, a former police detective who had come west for the dry air and slower days. He smiled politely, kept to himself, and never raised his voice. If you looked quickly, you would see nothing remarkable at all. Down the block, two unmarked cars idled, engines low, windows dark. Inside, federal agents watched the house and traded quiet notes. They had spent years digging through old files, listening to taped conversations, chasing rumors that sounded too outrageous to be true. A decorated New York City detective, one who had hunted organized crime for a living, secretly helping the very people he was supposed to bring down? It sounded like a movie plot, yet every new piece of evidence pulled them further toward the same unsettling name, Stephen Caracappa. The man with the trash bin felt the dry wind on his face and glanced up the street. Maybe he noticed the unfamiliar cars. Maybe he didn't. For decades he had lived with secrets, walking a very thin line between one world and another. Out here, thousands of miles from Brooklyn, it might have seemed that the past was finally buried under distance and time. But the agents knew better. They weren't there to ask casual questions. They were there because they believed that behind the quiet front door of that Las Vegas house lived one half of what reporters would soon call the mafia cops. To understand how that quiet retiree ended up there, and why federal agents had flown across the country to arrest a man who once wore the NYPD shield, you have to go back to the crowded streets and tight-knit neighborhoods of mid-20th century Brooklyn, where his life and his choices first began to take shape. Stephen Louis Caracappa was born in 1941, in a city still adjusting to peace after the Second World War. Brooklyn then was a patchwork of working-class blocks, small stores, parish schools, and families who knew far more about each other than anyone would today. In certain areas, especially among Italian-American communities, there was another presence too. Men in tailored coats who kept their voices low, who seemed to have money when others did not, and who were both respected and quietly feared. That world of traditional organized crime sat in the background of everyday life, half hidden, half acknowledged. Public records don't reveal much about his earliest years, but we know he grew up there, in that atmosphere, part of a generation of New Yorkers who learned early to recognize names, faces, and unspoken rules. The city around him was rougher than the one tourists see in old photographs. There was street violence, poverty, and a sense that law and order didn't reach every corner equally. For many kids of his age, there were two obvious paths to authority and respect. One was law enforcement, with its uniforms and rules. The other was the underworld, with its own code and its own kind of power. At some point as a young man, Stephen chose the badge. Whether it came from a straightforward desire for stability, from watching officers on his block, or from seeing crime up close and wanting a different road, he sought a place within the institution, meant to hold that darker world in check. By the late 1960s, he had entered the New York City Police Department, joining during a turbulent era defined by rising crime, social unrest, and a growing national attention on corruption and reform inside big city departments. The NYPD he walked into was huge and complicated, with thousands of officers, an often old-fashioned culture, and a constant drumbeat of calls over the radio. New recruits started at the bottom, answering domestic disputes, responding to robberies, writing endless reports. It was a place where you learned quickly whom you could trust, how to read a block at a glance, and when silence was as important as anything you said out loud. The job demanded a hard shell, but also a kind of flexibility. You needed to navigate street realities without drifting across lines you could never uncross. Over time, Stephen moved beyond basic patrol work. He earned promotions and entered the detective ranks, a sign that supervisors saw skill, persistence, or both. Detectives had more freedom than uniformed officers, but also more responsibility. They followed cases through, interviewed witnesses, cultivated informants, and learned to live in that permanent gray area between ordinary life and the worlds that produced shootings, disappearances, and quiet threats. In those years, Organized crime still held a strong grip over parts of New York. The major Italian-American groups, often referred to as families, weren't just rough characters on street corners. They controlled unions, gambling, loan sharking, and pieces of legitimate business. They also handled disputes in their own way. When arguments turned deadly, bodies sometimes appeared in alleys or parked cars or simply vanished altogether. For city leaders, the pressure grew. They needed officers and investigators who could truly understand those organizations, penetrate their inner circles, and connect scattered crimes into something that could stand up in court. Stephen gravitated toward that world professionally. By the late 1972 and early 1980s, he had become part of an elite group within the department, detectives who specialized in homicides tied to traditional organized crime. Eventually, he would help form and work in the Organized Crime Homicide Unit, a squad created to do something the city had never done systematically before. Track every killing linked to those powerful groups, build long-term cases, and understand the structure of the families well enough to go after high-ranking members, not just foot soldiers. In that role, he gained access to information that most people, even within the police, never saw. Case files on mob-connected killings, lists of confidential informants, surveillance reports, quiet intelligence about who might be turning against their own group, who owed money, who was being targeted. His job required building detailed mental maps of alliances and grudges inside the underworld, then using that knowledge to help prosecutors. It was painstaking work, and it gave him a reputation as a specialist. Coworkers later described him as reserved and methodical. He wasn't the stereotype of the loud, brash New York detective swaggering through a crime scene. He kept a low profile, did his paperwork, and appeared dedicated to his narrow area of expertise. That low-key manner made him easy to overlook. It also meant he could move through different units and precincts without drawing too much attention to himself, which in the world of sensitive investigations can be an asset or, in the wrong circumstances, a shield. While Stephen was developing his skills in mob-related homicide work, New York itself was changing. The 1980 seconds brought fierce battles between federal prosecutors and organized crime families. New laws made it possible to charge entire leadership structures under complex racketeering statutes. High-profile trials sent well-known figures to prison for long stretches, and some insiders decided to cooperate with authorities rather than follow the old rule of silence. Behind closed doors, mob leaders became paranoid, always looking for traitors in their ranks. That paranoia would eventually intersect with Stephen's life in a way few people could have imagined at the time. Inside the NYPD, organized crime detectives walked a perilous line. Their careers depended on building sources inside criminal networks. That meant talking with people who broke the law for a living, sometimes over years. Informants wanted something in return: protection, information, or favors. Detectives had to judge how far they could go without crossing into forbidden territory. That balance, trading just enough without giving too much, was part of the job. It also opened a door for temptation. When you spend your days with people who make large sums of money outside the law, watch them buy houses and cars while your own paycheck barely covers your mortgage, the pressure can twist judgment, especially if your moral boundaries are already weaker than they appear. By the early 1980 seconds, Stephen had met another NYPD detective whose path would intertwine with his in fateful ways: Eppolito. The two men were different in style. Eppolito came from a family with known links to organized crime and was boisterous, fond of attention, even appearing as an extra in films at one point. Stephen, in contrast, stayed in the background, the quieter half of any conversation. Yet they both worked in areas brushing up against the same criminal figures, and they both moved in circles where secrets and favors carried enormous weight. Their friendship grew over shared meals, gym sessions, and the camaraderie that develops when officers feel that only other cops truly understand what they see on the job. Around them, the city regarded organized crime detectives as part of a special club. They were the ones allowed behind certain closed doors, aware of evidence no one else could access, on a first-name basis with federal agents and prosecutors. It was an intoxicating status, especially in a culture that still valued toughness and connections. At some point, the line that separated professional contact with criminals from personal benefit began to blur for Stephen. The precise moment when he stepped from law enforcement into betrayal is hard to mark. There was no single dramatic scene where one choice changed everything. Instead, the shift came through a series of decisions that might have felt small at the start. Passing along a bit of information he shouldn't share, taking money to look something up, meeting privately with people he was supposed to investigate. What is clear from court records and later testimony is this. While he was working inside the organized crime homicide unit, the place created to solve murders linked to the mafia, he began secretly assisting one of the most dangerous organized crime figures in New York, the underboss of the Lucchese family, Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso. The man whose activities he was paid by the city to study and oppose became, in practice, his illicit employer. That hidden arrangement would eventually lead to at least 8 killings tied directly to favors or information from Stephen and his fellow detective. Names would later be read aloud in courtrooms. A suspected enemy of the Lucchese family abducted off the street, a jeweler who never came home, a mob insider hiding on the West Coast, tracked down from behind a police desk, an innocent man with the wrong name gunned down because of a tragic error in a database search. Years after the fact, jurors would sit and listen as prosecutors laid out how confidential files and police skills, meant to protect the public, had been twisted into tools for deadly vendettas. But all of that still lay ahead in those early days, when Stephen wore plain clothes, carried a shield that promised protection, and moved through New York's precinct houses as a respected specialist. He had not yet been pulled out of his quiet Las Vegas home by federal agents, not yet heard a judge pronounce a sentence that would ensure he would die in custody. He was, at that earlier point, a man standing in the middle of 2 competing loyalties, one to his oath and his badge, the other to money, influence, and powerful criminals. Standing in a cluttered squad room, surrounded by folders on mob killings, he might have looked like any career detective. Tired eyes, a desk stacked with reports, a phone that never stopped ringing. Outside, the city buzzed with cabs and sirens. Inside, he studied the names of mob leaders, soldiers, and associates, their photos and histories. Somewhere in that maze, his own name was slowly, almost invisibly, shifting from the list of hunters to the list of those who would one day be hunted. For the moment, though, no one around him suspected the full extent of what was beginning. His colleagues trusted him, prosecutors relied on his expertise, and the families of victims hoped that detectives like him would bring them justice. The idea that he would instead help certain killers stay one step ahead of the law would have seemed unthinkable. In the years that followed, that unthinkable idea became a hidden reality. The same skills that made him valuable to the NYPD, his detailed knowledge of mob structures, his access to confidential data, his ability to stay in the background made him invaluable to the men whose power rested on fear and silence. And slowly, steadily, the choices he made inside dimly lit diners and quiet back rooms would lead to that dry Las Vegas night, the unmarked cars on his block, and the firm knock on his front door that told him his past had finally caught up. The first approach did not come from a boss in a silk suit, or from a whispered proposal in some smoky back room. It came through a middleman, a figure who moved between the outer edge of law enforcement and the world it was supposed to contain. His name was Burton Kaplan, a Brooklyn businessman with ties to the Lucchese crime family, someone who understood the value of information better than most. He traded in quiet favors and private introductions, and he knew which detectives handled the cases that mattered to his associates. During the mid-1982s, New York's traditional crime groups were under enormous strain. Federal prosecutors were bringing large racketeering cases, using new laws to go after bosses who had once seemed untouchable. Cooperators people once sworn to silence were beginning to talk. For men like Lucchese underboss Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso, that new reality felt like a constant threat. He wanted early warnings about investigations, the names of people who might be turning against him, and the home addresses of rivals. To get all that, he needed someone on the inside. Kaplan had an answer. He knew Louis Eppolito from Brooklyn and understood that Eppolito's work as a detective in anti-organized crime units gave him access to sensitive details. Through Eppolito, Kaplan met Stephen Caracappa, who by then was serving in the organized crime homicide unit, focused almost entirely on mob-related killings. Together, those two detectives had precisely what Casso needed: access to internal intelligence, computer records, informant lists, and ongoing case files. Meetings were arranged out of uniform, away from station houses. Accounts differ on the exact location of their first real agreement, but later testimony made the core arrangement clear. In exchange for steady payments, thousands of dollars every month, plus extra money for special services, Stephen and his fellow detective would quietly supply information from within the police department to Kaplan, who passed it along to Casso. They would run names through databases, check addresses, identify suspected cooperators, and even help locate people who were hiding under assumed identities. At that time, the NYPD's computer systems were not as sophisticated as modern ones, but they were powerful enough. A detective with the right clearances could look up license plates, driver's license data, criminal histories, and sealed reports on protected witnesses. As a senior investigator in a specialized unit, Stephen could access records tied to some of the city's most sensitive probes. That position, meant to help solve homicides, became the foundation of a corruption scheme that would later shock both the department and the public. Money began to change hands. According to later government witnesses, Stephen and his colleague received irregular cash retainer figures in testimony ranged around $4,000 each per month at various times. They also accepted extra sums for particular favors, especially when their information led directly to violence against Casso's rivals or suspected enemies. The arrangement turned confidential files into a kind of menu. If Casso wanted to find someone, he could simply ask his inside men. One of the earliest and most disturbing episodes involved a young man from Brooklyn named James Hydell. Hydell was believed by Casso to have been involved in an attempt on his life. Casso wanted him found. In a lawful investigation, detectives might track a suspect through surveillance, warrants, and careful groundwork. In this hidden arrangement, Stephen's role was far simpler and far more dangerous. He used his department access to look up Hydell's license plate and address, then quietly passed those details to Kaplan, who relayed them to Casso. Hydell was later seized near his mother's home by men loyal to Casso. He disappeared after that abduction and was never seen in public again. Decades later, in court, prosecutors would argue that without the address and vehicle information obtained from NYPD systems, that kidnapping might not have happened, or at least would have been far more difficult. Stephen had transformed a police tool designed to help protect the city into a weapon for a criminal leader settling a personal score. Around the same period, Casso was obsessed with identifying everyone involved in the effort to kill him. Another name reached him, a man known around Brooklyn as Nicky Guido. Once again, he turned to his inside sources. Stephen did what detectives routinely do: he searched department records for that name. The problem was that there was more than one person named Nicholas Guido in the broader area. According to evidence presented later, Stephen passed along the identity of the wrong man, someone with no real connection to the attack on Casso. On Christmas Day 1986, the innocent Nicholas Guido, unaware that his name had surfaced in a deadly feud he had nothing to do with, was sitting in a car in front of a relative's house when shooters approached and opened fire. He died there, in a quiet Brooklyn street, simply because his name was a match in a database that had been misused. In later years, when the story came out during trial testimony, it stunned observers. A simple internal search, done by a detective sworn to uphold the law, had set in motion the killing of a completely uninvolved young man. Stephen remained in his homicide post, drawing his city salary and continuing to investigate other mob-connected deaths in an official capacity, even as he funneled certain pieces of intelligence out the back door. Coworkers saw only the surface, a steady, understated detective who knew the details of complex cases. To his colleagues, he appeared reliable. The phrase "mafia cop" had not yet been coined, and the idea that two men in such specialized roles could be doing the bidding of a violent underboss still seemed too extreme to consider. The flow of information to Casso grew broader over time. According to later accounts, Stephen and his partner checked whether specific people were cooperating with law enforcement, especially those around the Lucchese organization. Casso was constantly worried about rats inside his ranks, and having someone in the police department who could confirm or deny suspicions gave him a sense of control. When a mobster within the Lucchese family came under suspicion of informing, Kepton would pass the name on, and Stephen would check confidential files or talk discreetly with contacts in other units or agencies. One such episode centered on a Lucchese member named Bruno Facciola. Rumors in the underworld suggested he might be talking to authorities. Casso wanted to know if that was true. Evidence presented years later indicated that Stephen accessed sensitive files and confirmed that Facciola's name appeared in relation to cooperation, feeding that confirmation back through Kaplan. Shortly afterward, Facciola was summoned under false pretenses and killed by his own associates, who believed he had betrayed them. Again, the extended details of that killing are disturbing, but the key fact for understanding Stephen's role is that his misuse of confidential information marked Facciola for death. Instead of using inside knowledge to protect potential witnesses, he did the reverse, turning them into targets for retaliation. Stephen's growing entanglement with Casso did not stop at providing background details. Over time, the arrangement expanded into more direct involvement in planned attacks. One of the most striking examples was the killing of a man who had once been part of the Lucchese organization, but had fallen out of favor, and was thought to be cooperating with authorities, Anthony Delappi. Delappi had tried to put distance between himself and his former associates, moving from New York to the West Coast and living under a different identity. For most criminals attempting to escape a powerful organization, relocation and a new name were lifelines. Their safety depended on the possibility that their old bosses couldn't find them. But Delappi's former underboss had unusual resources. According to trial testimony, Casso asked Kaplan to have the detectives locate Delappi through law enforcement channels. Stephen, with access to multiple databases, searched for variations on Delappi's identity and eventually found him registered under his true name in California. The detectives provided both the address and key identifying details, which Casso's associates used to track Delappi to a garage in Los Angeles in 1990. There, he was ambushed and killed. In later proceedings, the government described this as a stark example of how Stephen's willingness to exploit his position extended beyond local disputes. His reach from behind a New York desk stretched across the continent, undermining the protection, relocation, and distance should have provided. By this point, the sums changing hands had grown larger. There were allegations that Stephen and his colleague received substantial bonus payments when their assistants directly facilitated a successful attack on Casso's enemies or suspected traitors. At the same time, they remained on the New York City payroll, drawing pensions credits for years of service, even as they secretly worked for one of the most dangerous criminals in the country. Another high-profile episode occurred closer to home. In November 1990, Gambino family captain Edward Lino was shot to death while driving on the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn. The slaying was unusual even by organized crime standards. Witnesses described a car that appeared to have conducted a traffic stop, pulling Lino over before shots were fired. Years later, Casso testified that he had hired Stephen and his partner to carry out this killing themselves, using their status as police officers to make Lino believe he was dealing with a routine stop, not an execution. In court, there was debate about precise details, and defense lawyers disputed aspects of Casso's account. However, the jury ultimately accepted prosecution evidence tying the detectives to that ambush. The image shocked the public imagination. Two men sworn to uphold traffic safety and investigate killings allegedly using their badges, or at least the appearance of law enforcement authority, to disarm a target before taking his life on a public highway. Throughout these years, Stephen managed to maintain his official career. Inside the organized crime homicide unit, he continued assisting on cases against various mob figures, helping to put some people in prison even as he quietly helped others evade arrest or worse. He occupied a contradictory role. On paper, a specialist helping to dismantle violent groups. Behind the scenes, a paid source for one of those groups' leaders. Suspicion eventually flickered inside the department, though not in a way that immediately brought everything into the open. At one point, internal affairs and federal investigators heard rumors that someone inside law enforcement might be feeding information to Casso. There were scattered clues, tips dying on the vine. Suspects who always seemed one step ahead. But concrete proof was hard to find. Casso himself remained at large for years, waging his own wars and avoiding capture through a mix of caution, brutality, and, as it would later turn out, help from his contacts in uniform. Stephen's demeanor helped deflect attention. He was not flashy with his money, did not dramatically upgrade his lifestyle overnight, and rarely drew notice to himself in social settings. That restraint made it easier for him to claim that he lived only on his police salary. Even people who might have wondered privately about certain coincidences lacked enough evidence or confidence to challenge a colleague with his seniority and specialized reputation. As the late 1000 980 seconds slid into the early 990 seconds. The national campaign against traditional organized crime kept intensifying. Federal cases struck at bosses across multiple families. Long prison sentences became more common, and the old culture of absolute silence eroded further. Undercover recordings captured conversations once thought to be safe. Hidden microphones appeared in clubhouses and meeting spots. Behind closed doors, bosses whispered about leaks and wondered whom they could still trust. In that climate, Stephen's secret relationship with Casso carried even higher stakes. A single cooperating witness from the Lucchese family, if aware of the full arrangement, could have destroyed his career and exposed him to prosecution. Yet Casso himself remained committed to the deal, convinced that having men inside the NYPD gave him a critical edge. So Stephen moved forward, still running searches, still checking informant files, still passing along details through Kaplan, as if this double life could stretch on indefinitely. What Stephen could not foresee was that the very man whose power he had helped protect would eventually become a government witness. When Casso was finally captured and faced the possibility of spending the rest of his days in a cell, he made a decision that would eventually drag his two police contacts into the spotlight they had long avoided. The underboss who had once demanded loyalty at any cost began to talk, and among the stories he chose to share with federal agents were those about detectives who, for years, had quietly sold him the secrets they were supposed to guard. For the moment, while Stephen still sat in New York squad rooms sifting through case folders, those future confessions lay in the distance. He remained outwardly a seasoned investigator, inwardly committed to a dangerous bargain. The choices he had already made, running a license plate for the wrong Nicholas Guido, searching databases for people in hiding, confirming the suspicions that doomed men like Bruno Facciola, allegedly staging a highway stop that ended a Gambino captain's life, could not be taken back. They existed now as buried facts, waiting for the day when someone would finally dig deep enough to bring them to light. By the early 990 seconds, the quiet double life Stephen was leading had already left a trail that most people could not see. Files in distant offices mentioned names and dates. Grieving families mourned relatives whose deaths were written off as one more act in a long feud. Inside the organized crime homicide unit, Stephen still walked from desk to desk with case folders in hand, answering questions, attending meetings, and traveling to crime scenes as if his only loyalty lay with the department. The partnership with Anthony Casso kept drawing him deeper. Casso's world had become a maze of suspicion. Almost everyone, in his mind, could be a potential traitor. He demanded answers, and he wanted those answers to come from someone he could trust absolutely. That someone was supposed to be Stephen and the other detective at his side. One of the most telling episodes in that period revolved around a Lucchese captain named Peter Chiodo. Chiodo had been a significant figure in the family, involved in various rackets. When federal pressure mounted, rumors began to circulate about who might give in and cooperate. Casso, already haunted by the idea of turncoats, decided that Chiodo had become a problem. On a spring morning in 1991, Chiodo was ambushed while sitting in his car in Brooklyn. He survived the attempt, barely, and was moved into protective custody. Facing the reality that his own organization had turned on him, he agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. In exchange, the government promised not only to protect him, but to extend that protection to his immediate family. For Casso, this was intolerable. He wanted to strike back at Chiodo by reaching his relatives, and to do that he needed information only law enforcement or government agencies would normally possess. Secret addresses, phone numbers, the new locations of people who had been moved quietly for safety. According to later testimony, this was another moment when he turned to Stephen, through Burton Kaplan, and asked the detectives to find out where Chiodo's family members were hiding. Stephen had access to multiple systems, vehicle registrations, property databases, other agencies' files shared with the NYPD. Investigators later said that he ran searches designed to uncover the address of Chiodo's sister, who had been relocated out of state for her protection. That address, passed along through Kaplan, reached Casso's people. Soon afterward, armed men went to that location and attacked Chiodo's sister. She survived, but the message was clear. Even cooperation with the federal government could not fully shield someone from a determined, organized crime leader with allies inside law enforcement. In the calm language of a courtroom transcript, that chain of events was later laid out as another example of Stephen's betrayal. Instead of using his position to help secure the safety of witnesses and their families, he had helped erode that safety, turning confidential relocation details into a roadmap for reprisals. The pattern repeated in other ways. Kaplan sometimes came to Stephen with requests that were not purely about Casso's internal wars. He was a businessman involved in criminal ventures of his own, including large-scale marijuana trafficking. When a shipment went missing or someone stole from his operation, he wanted swift retribution. In at least one instance later described in court, Kaplan used Stephen's ability to run license plates and dig into personal data to locate a suspected thief who had robbed an associate. Not long after, that man was found and killed. For investigators reviewing these events years later, the exact boundaries between Casso-ordered hits and Kaplan odd-driven vendettas mattered less than the underlying truth. Stephen repeatedly took confidential law enforcement information and turned it into fuel for private violence. Whether the motive was a mob feud, a drug dispute, or revenge for a theft, the method remained the same. He sat at a police desk, typed names and numbers into a terminal, and then carried what he found into a world where such knowledge could cost a person his life. By the time the early 1990 seconds arrived, the list of cases touched by Stephen's cooperation with Casso had grown alarming. Prosecutors would later connect him to information that led to the abduction and killing of James Hydell, the mistaken identification that cost the innocent Nicholas Guido his life, the outing of Lucchese insider Bruno Facciola as a suspected cooperator, the tracking of Anthony Delapi across the country to Los Angeles, the highway ambush of Gambino Captain Edward Lino, the targeting of Peter Chiodo's family, after Chiodo entered witness protection, at least one killing linked to a drug-related dispute involving Kaplan's business, and yet, inside the NYPD, Stephen retained his status as a respected mob homicide specialist. To most observers, his career appeared stable. He had decades of service, institutional knowledge, and a reputation for methodical work. While some people in law enforcement circles had heard vague whispers that Casso boasted about having police sources, the idea that a senior detective in the organized crime homicide unit could be on a mobster's payroll still felt closer to rumor than reality. Then, the ground began to shift. In 1992, Internal Affairs and federal agents received more concrete hints that officers might be leaking information. They revisited old leads, including statements from insiders like Peter Chiodo. After agreeing to cooperate, Chiodo told authorities that Casso had bragged about having 2 detectives who helped him, describing them as highly placed and reliable. Casso, still on the run at that point, hadn't named them publicly, but the fact that a senior Lucchese figure repeated the story gave it more weight. Around the same time, Burton Kaplan's separate criminal life started to unravel. Federal investigators, pursuing a large drug case, targeted Kaplan and others involved in a substantial marijuana distribution ring. In 1992, Kaplan was arrested and eventually convicted on those charges. He received a long sentence and was sent to federal prison. Through all of that, he kept quiet about his most valuable secret: the 2 detectives who had been helping him and Casso for years. Stephen watched these developments from inside the department. He saw headlines about Kaplan's conviction. He knew that if Kaplan ever decided to talk, he could expose everything. Whether fear played a role in what happened next remains a matter of speculation, but the timing is clear. In 1992, after more than 2 decades in law enforcement, Stephen retired from the NYPD. On paper, it was an ordinary end to a long career. He was in his early 50s, with enough years of service to draw a comfortable pension. Colleagues might have seen it as a man stepping away before burnout fully set in, or as someone making a logical move toward a quieter life. No internal charges were brought against him at that moment. There was gossip, as there always is in big organizations, but nothing firm enough to challenge a detective of his seniority. After his retirement, Stephen stayed in New York for a period, taking work as an investigator in a civilian role. He used his experience to review old cases and assist with administrative tasks. That job kept him connected to law enforcement circles while he adjusted to life without a badge. Eventually, though, he decided to make a more dramatic change. He left New York and moved west, settling in Las Vegas. The city he chose was very different from the Brooklyn neighborhoods, where he had grown up and worked. Las Vegas sprawled across the desert, a mix of retirees, casino workers, hospitality staff, and people chasing second chances. Stephen bought a modest house in a quiet development far from the neon of the Strip. Neighbors later described him as polite and reserved. He walked his dog, tended his yard, and exchanged small talk about the heat and the rising property taxes. From the outside, he looked like many other former public employees who had come to Nevada for its climate and its lower cost of living. In interviews long after the fact, people on his block said they had no idea about his past beyond the simple fact that he had once been a cop in New York. He did not boast about old war stories. He did not hint at connections. He seemed, if anything, determined to keep his life uneventful. Meanwhile, the underworld he had once helped still churned back east. In 1993, Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso was finally captured after years as a fugitive. The arrest was big news. Federal authorities had been hunting him relentlessly, tying him to numerous acts of violence and to a central role in the operations of the Lucchese family. Brought into custody, facing the possibility of spending the rest of his natural life in prison, Casso made a crucial choice. He agreed to cooperate with the government. Over months of debriefings, he spoke with federal agents and prosecutors about murders, extortion schemes, internal betrayals, and his dealings with other crime families. Among the many startling things he told them was a story about two detectives from the NYPD who had worked for him for years. He described how they supplied names and addresses, how they ran license plates, how they helped him find people he wanted gone. He even gave their names, Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa. The claim was explosive. If true, it meant that a highly specialized homicide detective and his longtime friend had been on the payroll of a notorious underboss. But Casso himself was a deeply compromised witness. He had a history of extreme violence and of shading the truth when it suited him. Prosecutors listened, took notes, and started checking what he said against existing records. Some of his details lined up with known events. Others were harder to verify. Agents looked at old murders Casso mentioned, at times and addresses, at the dates of various killings. They compared them against work schedules, assignment records, and internal NYPD documents for Eppolito and Stephen. Some patterns raised interest, but there were gaps. Without more solid corroboration, it would be risky to build an entire case on the word of a man like Casso. So, for a time, the allegations hovered in an uncertain space. Federal authorities kept them in mind, but they did not immediately bring charges. Casso's cooperation itself later fell apart. He proved too erratic and untrustworthy in other matters, and the government stopped using him as a witness. When that happened, any direct path to prosecuting Stephen seemed to close. The story of two detectives on my payroll lingered as a disturbing possibility, but one without enough support to place before a jury. Back in Las Vegas, Stephen's life appeared tranquil. He worked occasionally in security or consulting roles, applying his law enforcement background in lower stress environments. He passed background checks, paid his bills, and aged into his 60s. He married, settled into routines, and kept his circle small. When people asked about his time in New York, he talked about the job in general terms: long hours, tough cases, the strain of seeing so much wrongdoing. He did not volunteer that one of the city's most feared mobsters had once claimed him as a paid ally. The person who knew more than anyone else about that side of his life sat in a federal prison cell hundreds of miles away. Burton Kaplan, serving his long drug sentence, had so far managed to keep his secret. He understood that if he ever revealed the full story of his dealings with Stephen and his fellow detective, he would be opening a door that could never be shut again. The men he would be accusing were former law enforcement officers. The scrutiny would be intense. He also understood that the value of what he knew might one day be the only leverage he had left. As the late 1,990 seconds approached, Kaplan began to feel the weight of his age and his sentence. He was no longer a middle-aged businessman juggling schemes on the outside. He was a prisoner facing the realistic possibility that he would die behind bars. At the same time, the broader legal landscape had evolved. Prosecutors had learned more about old mob cases, revisited unsolved killings, and developed new techniques for connecting scattered pieces of evidence. The tale Casso had told years earlier about two corrupt detectives had not been forgotten. It simply lacked the final push needed to become a prosecutable case. Eventually, quiet contacts were made. Federal agents approached Kaplan and suggested that if he had information of real significance, This might be the time to share it. At first, he tested the waters slowly, talking in general terms. As discussions progressed, he offered more specific claims. Names, dates, places, payment amounts, descriptions of meetings in cars and diners, even notes about how the detectives like to receive their money. For Stephen, far away in Las Vegas, there was no obvious sign that anything had changed. He continued his routines, unaware that a man he had once trusted was now speaking in detail to federal investigators about their years of secret collaboration. In offices across New York, agents pulled long closed files from storage, spread them across tables, and began circling familiar names. They re-examined the deaths of Heidel, Guido, Facciola, Delapi, Lino, and others. They compared Kaplan's statements to prior evidence, to phone records, to travel histories, to old internal affairs reports. Slowly, a picture began to form that did not rest solely on the word of a volatile underboss. The story that had seemed like a dark rumor when Casso first told it grew more concrete through Kaplan's patient, methodical recollections. He described how Stephen sat at his desk in the organized crime homicide unit, how requests for information were relayed, how cash was delivered in envelopes or bags, how sometimes there were extra payments when their work led directly to a successful hit, in Casso's language. Kaplan even produced notes he had kept, cryptic at first glance but aligning with known events when examined carefully. What remained was to link all of that to the present day, to build not just a story of past wrongdoing but a case that could stand on the strict standards of federal court. That process would take years, stretching into the early 2000s, as investigators sought every possible piece of corroboration. While they worked, Stephen lived under the desert sun, mowing his lawn, driving to grocery stores, chatting briefly with clerks who had no idea that paperwork bearing his name now sat in thick binders marked with evidence stickers thousands of miles away. The first clear sign that the past was no longer sleeping came not in Stephen's life, but in a conference room in Brooklyn. Federal agents sat across from Burton Kaplan, tape recorder running, folders open. They had heard pieces of his story before, but now they pressed for the full version. Who had given him police information? How often? For what price? Names, dates, exact services. Kaplan, older and tired, began to talk in a steady, almost businesslike way. He described years of quiet meetings with two detectives, Stephen Caracappa and Eppolito. He told them how he would bring a request, how one of the detectives would run names or plates through confidential systems, how answers came back written on slips of paper or spoken softly in parked cars. He explained the payment structure, a regular monthly fee, plus extra cash when their help made a real difference for Anthony Casso or for Kaplan's own criminal ventures. Agents had heard many informants over the years, some boasting, some confused. What startled them here was how well Kaplan's details fit the events they already knew. He recounted the hunt for James Heidel, down to the use of DMV records. He told them about the mix-up that led to the wrong Nicholas Guido. He walked them through the search for Anthony Delapi in California, the confirmation of Bruno Facciola as a suspected cooperator, the effort to locate Peter Chiodo's relatives, and information passed on about other targets and suspected thieves. They checked those statements against old reports, timesheets, and other witnesses' stories. Time after time, the dates lined up. A request from Casso would be followed by a phone call from Kaplan to the detectives. Shortly after, the detectives' work logs showed them near a computer terminal, or in the office where confidential files were kept. Within days, someone Casso feared or hated would disappear, be ambushed, or find that private movements were somehow known to his enemies. On their own, any one of those coincidences might have been explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that was hard to ignore. One thing still bothered the team, though. These allegations were about events that had taken place many years earlier. If they brought a case now, defense lawyers would argue about time limits and fading memories. Prosecutors needed something fresher, something to show that the corruption was not just a distant mistake, but part of an ongoing pattern. Around this time, another group of federal agents, this time from the Drug Enforcement Administration, had their eyes on a very different problem in Las Vegas. They were following leads on a drug trafficking ring that wanted to move large quantities of illegal substances through the Southwest. An informant mentioned, almost casually, that there were 2 retired New York cops in town who might be willing to help with things for the right price. The names given were familiar to anyone who had been listening to Kaplan's sessions. Louis Eppolito, and, soon enough, his quiet friend, Stephen Caracappa. After leaving New York, Eppolito had tried to build a new life in the desert. He wrote a memoir about being a cop from a family with mob ties, did small acting jobs, and tried to sell movie scripts. Stephen lived nearby, more withdrawn, taking security work and low-profile investigative jobs. They socialized, exercised together, and appeared to enjoy the comfortable anonymity of being two ex-WA detectives far from the cold and pressure of Brooklyn. To the DEA, the idea that these two would risk everything again seemed bold, but not impossible. They began probing more carefully. An undercover agent posed as a drug trafficker, looking for reliable help moving large loads between states. Through the informant, he reached Eppolito, who in turn brought Stephen into the picture. There were quiet meetings in restaurants and cars, away from the casinos, where the agent explained what he supposedly needed: assistance in moving significant amounts of contraband, protection if law enforcement asked questions, a possible help finding out if there were leaks. Stephen did not dominate these conversations. He let his more talkative friend handle most of the talk, but he sat there, listened, asked occasional questions, and crucially, did not walk away. At one recorded meeting, the undercover agent described a plan to transport a large shipment of illegal drugs across state lines. The proposed fee was substantial. Eppolito talked about contacts, about how he and Stephen understood law enforcement tactics, about how they could steer the load away from trouble. Stephen didn't object. On recordings later played in court, he could be heard participating, making it plain that he knew what was being discussed and what he was agreeing to. Now the two threads, Kaplan's account of past murders and the DEA's current drug investigation, came together. For prosecutors in Brooklyn, this was the missing piece. They could now argue that the same men who had allegedly sold information to Casso in the 1980 seconds and early 1990 seconds were still willing, years later, to trade on their law enforcement experience for criminal profit. Once enough evidence was gathered, plans were made to move. By early 2005, an indictment had been drafted under seal in federal court in Brooklyn, charging Stephen and his partner with racketeering conspiracy, multiple counts tied to specific killings, kidnapping, witness tampering, obstruction, and the newer drug trafficking offenses from the Las Vegas sting. The document laid out a story that stretched across 2 decades, from the days when Casso ruled with fear in New York to the quieter desert years when the two retired detectives thought they had escaped serious scrutiny. The arrest came on the 9th of March 2005. That evening, Stephen and his friend left a restaurant just off the Strip, where they had met with the undercover agent and others. As they headed toward their cars in the parking lot, agents closed in. There was no shootout, no dramatic chase, just a sudden press of law enforcement, badges out, voices identifying themselves, instructions to put hands where they could be seen. Stephen, then in his early 60s, did what he had once told other suspects to do. He complied, hands up, likely stunned at the speed with which a normal night had turned into something else. Handcuffs clicked around the same wrists that had once held them out to others. Passersby looked over, curious, not realizing that they were witnessing the arrest of a man who would soon be labeled in headlines as half of the mafia cops. Agents searched his home in Las Vegas, seizing papers, computers, and anything that might connect him further to Kaplan, Casso, or the drug sting. Neighbors woke to see unfamiliar vehicles lining the street, men in jackets marked with federal agency initials moving quietly in and out. Later, when news crews came by, people on the block would say that they had known him only as a retired detective, a calm, polite man who put out his trash on time and waved before driving away. Soon after the arrest, Stephen was brought before a magistrate judge in Nevada, then transferred on a federal warrant to New York to face the charges in the Eastern District of New York. The flight back was not like his early trips as a detective escorting prisoners. This time he sat as the accused, watched over by marshals. In Brooklyn, the unsealed indictment drew instant attention. Newspapers, television, and radio all ran with the story of 2 former NYPD detectives accused of serving a notorious underboss. Reporters repeated the phrase, "mafia cops," again and again, a label that stuck. Stephen's name, once known only inside certain law enforcement circles, now appeared across front pages linked to words like racketeering, conspiracy, and murder. At the first major hearing, Prosecutors outlined the case in broad strokes: a long-running relationship with Casso, payments for information, a series of killings allegedly facilitated or carried out by the detectives, and more recent evidence from the Las Vegas drug operation. Stephen's defense attorney argued that the charges were built on the word of criminals trying to gain favors, that the time gap made a fair defense nearly impossible, and that Stephen was a retired public servant being smeared by unreliable cooperators. The judge, Jack Weinstein, a veteran of complex federal cases, listened carefully. He ordered that Stephen and his co-defendant remain in custody pending trial, citing the seriousness of the allegations. For the first time in his life, Stephen entered a jail cell as a prisoner, held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. The sounds and smells were unfamiliar, in a way he had never experienced before. As a detective, he had always been able to walk back out. Now the door closed behind him and stayed shut. Over the next year, legal teams on both sides worked through piles of material. Prosecutors turned over evidence, transcripts of Kaplan's interviews, summaries of other cooperators' statements, financial records, old NYPD documents, travel and phone data, and recordings from the DEA sting. Defense lawyers filed motions to dismiss or limit the case, arguing, among other things, that the statute of limitations had long since expired on some of the old crimes, and that the racketeering theory stretched too far. The court allowed most of the charges to proceed, accepting the government's argument that the conspiracy described in the indictment had continued into more recent years, especially with the drug charges, and that the pattern of conduct could be considered as one continuous enterprise. In early 2006, jury selection began in a federal courtroom in Brooklyn. Potential jurors were asked if they could remain fair in a case that involved claims of corruption by police officers and stories of organized crime. Many said they could. Some admitted they had seen media coverage but promised to base their decisions on the evidence presented in court. When the trial opened, Stephen sat at the defense table in a suit, glasses on, hair now gray. He took notes, leaned toward his attorney to whisper comments, and kept his face mostly still as the judge explained the charges. Across the aisle, in the gallery, families of several people named as victims watched quietly. Some had waited years for answers. Others had long believed their loved ones were caught in mob feuds that would never be fully explained. The government's presentation began with an overview from the lead prosecutor. He told the jury that they would hear about a detective who had sworn to protect the public, but instead chose to assist a violent underboss in exchange for money. He walked them through the timeline: the formation of the organized crime homicide unit, the first contact with Kaplan, the early services like running license plates, the gradual shift into more serious misconduct, the specific killings allegedly linked to the detective's actions, the retirement to Las Vegas, and, finally, the more recent drug case that showed, in the government's view, that the pattern had never truly stopped. Then came the witnesses. One by one, people connected to the Lucchese organization, to Kaplan's business operations, and to various victims, took the stand. They described orders handed down, messages relayed, names given, and outcomes paid for. There were also law enforcement witnesses, agents who had worked the original mob cases, investigators from internal affairs, specialists who interpreted phone records and computer logs. When Kaplan himself walked into the courtroom to testify, the room grew very still. Here was the man who had bridged the gap between the underworld and the police department, the middleman who could speak directly to Stephen's alleged role. Under questioning, he told the jury about the first time he approached Eppolito and Stephen, about their discussion of payments, about the understanding they reached. He spoke in detail about individual events: the search for Heidel, the wrong Nicholas Guido, the checks on suspected cooperators, the tracking of Delapi, the information about Peter Chiodo's family. Defense lawyers cross-examined him aggressively. They reminded the jury that Kaplan was a convicted drug trafficker hoping for sentence reductions, that he had lied in the past, that his own hands were far from clean. He acknowledged all that, but insisted that on this subject, he was telling the truth. He said he had kept notes precisely because he anticipated a day when he might need to recall the specifics of his dealings with the detectives. Stephen watched as Kaplan pointed him out across the courtroom and said, in effect, "This is one of the men who helped us." For someone who had spent a career presenting cases as an investigator, it must have been a surreal reversal to sit there as another man, once an ally, laid out a narrative that, if believed, would send him to prison for the rest of his life. The trial would last for weeks, with many more witnesses still to come. But by the time Kaplan stepped down from the stand, the outline of the government's case was clear. A long, hidden relationship, a series of deadly outcomes, and a present-day sting that, prosecutors argued, showed that Stephen's willingness to cross the line had not been a youthful mistake, but part of a long-standing pattern. Inside the cell block at the detention center each night, after the day's testimony ended, Stephen had hours to think. He was no longer the man walking the Las Vegas streets unnoticed, no longer the detective in the quiet corner of a Brooklyn squad room. He was an accused former officer listening while the justice system he once served tried to decide what his true role in the city's dark history had been. The trial moved forward day after day, the courtroom settling into its own rhythm. After Burton Kaplan stepped down, other witnesses took the stand to fill in gaps, to show that his story didn't float in the air by itself. Former members of organized crime groups testified under cooperation agreements, explaining how orders traveled from Anthony Casso downward. They described meetings where Casso said he had his cops, how he boasted that he could find anyone, even those hiding under changed names. They talked about specific killings. A young man lured off the street after his location was traced, a relative of a cooperating witness attacked far from New York, a former insider shot in California after trying to start over. None of these men were saints. Defense lawyers reminded the jury repeatedly that every one of them had pleaded guilty to serious offenses and was seeking consideration in sentencing. Still, when their accounts were matched against Kaplan's dates, phone calls, and movements inside police units, the pieces clicked together more than they contradicted. Detectives and agents who had worked the original homicides testified too. They recalled being puzzled years earlier by how quickly certain mob figures seemed to learn about sealed warrants or confidential plans. They showed old crime scene photos, not graphic, but enough to ground the jury in the reality that behind each name was a person whose family had once expected them home. They produced paperwork from NYPD computer systems showing when license plates were run, when addresses were checked, who had terminal access, which unit was officially working, which case. Then came the DEA agents from Las Vegas. One undercover officer, using his real name in court but still shielded carefully, recounted how he had posed as a trafficker looking for protection and logistical help. He described the first contact through an intermediary, the introduction to Eppolito, and the early conversations that led to a meeting where Stephen appeared as well. Jurors listened to audio recordings. The quality wasn't perfect, but the voices were clear enough. They heard talk about loads, about how law enforcement typically monitored highways, about tricks to avoid drawing attention during long drives. They listened as the undercover agent offered money for assistance, and as Eppolito enthusiastically accepted, with Stephen quietly but plainly joining the agreement. Nobody on the recording thought they were discussing anything legal. There was no pretense of an above-board security job. It was, as the DEA agent told the jury, a conversation about protecting large movements of illegal drugs. The government presented bank deposit slips, records of cash found during later searches, and other documents to suggest that the men were still willing to cross serious lines for profit. For prosecutors, this more recent conduct mattered as much as the old. It gave them a way to argue that the pattern of betrayal had spanned decades, not just a brief window in the distant past. Stephen's defense team tried to chip away at each part. They suggested that Kaplan had tailored his story to match whatever investigators already suspected, filling in blanks to make himself indispensable. They highlighted inconsistencies between different cooperators. They argued that the DEA sting recordings showed more bragging than action, that Stephen had been more of a passive presence than an active participant, that no drugs actually changed hands during the operation. They also called witnesses from Stephen's NYPD years, former colleagues who said they had always known him as a quiet, diligent detective. These officers spoke about long hours, complicated cases, the grief of families who came begging for justice. They said they never saw unexplained wealth, never saw Stephen live beyond his means. One retired supervisor said he would have trusted Stephen with his life during those days in the squad. When the time came for Stephen to decide whether to testify, his lawyers advised against it. If he took the stand, prosecutors could cross-examine him about every case in the indictment, every inconsistency in his career, every unaccounted-for meeting with Kaplan. In the end, Stephen chose not to speak to the jury directly. He remained at the defense table, listening as his attorneys argued on his behalf rather than facing the prosecutors himself. By the time both sides rested, the jurors had heard weeks of evidence, The judge then read out detailed instructions, explaining each count: racketeering conspiracy, murder in aid of racketeering, kidnapping, witness retaliation, drug trafficking, and related charges. He told them that they had to weigh each element carefully to decide whether the government had proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt. In closing arguments, the prosecutor walked the jury back through the timeline. He described a young detective who had risen into a sensitive unit, who then accepted thousands of dollars each month from a violent underboss. He reminded them of the Heidel abduction, the mistaken killing of the wrong Nicholas Guido after a database check, the outing of suspected cooperators, the cross-country tracking of a man who thought he was safe in Los Angeles, the highway ambush of a Gambino captain, the attacks on a cooperating witness's family, and the later willingness to help move drugs in the Southwest. You cannot see into a person's heart, the prosecutor told them, but you can see what his choices produce. He pointed to the names on the indictment, to the tapes from Las Vegas, to the steady flow of cash described by Kaplan. He said this was not a matter of one bad decision, but a long course of conduct that turned a badge into a paid tool of organized crime. Stephen's attorney responded by reminding the jury of reasonable doubt. He said that every key witness against his client was a criminal with something to gain. He argued that there was no physical evidence, no fingerprints on murder weapons tying Stephen to any scene, no direct surveillance showing him handing over confidential files. He said the timeline relied too heavily on assumptions, that because a computer was accessed, it must have been Stephen, that because Kaplan said a phone call happened at a certain time, it must have gone exactly as Kaplan now recalled. He also pointed out that some killings in the mob world might have occurred regardless of what any detective did or did not do, that organized crime had long had its own ways of finding out who was betraying whom. He urged the jury not to fill in gaps with speculation just because the story sounded compelling. After closing arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. They had stacks of exhibits, copies of transcripts, and their own notes. Hour after hour, they worked through each charge, sending occasional questions to the judge, requests to rehear portions of testimony, clarifications of legal standards. In the detention center, Stephen waited, his days suddenly reduced to short walks in a concrete yard, meals on a rigid schedule, and the slow turning of time until the next call to return to court. On the 6th of April, 2006, the jury filed back into the courtroom. Everyone stood as the judge took the bench. Stephen watched from his chair, expression tight but controlled. The foreperson held a sheet of paper and, when prompted, began reading out the answers. Guilty on the racketeering conspiracy. Guilty on the counts tied to specific killings in aid of racketeering. Guilty on charges connected to kidnapping and the targeting of witnesses. Guilty on the narcotics conspiracy charge stemming from the Las Vegas sting. Count after count, the word guilty echoed around the room. As each one landed, murmurs rippled through the gallery. Relatives of victims gripped each other's hands, some quietly crying. On the defense side, family members of the accused wiped their faces or stared blankly ahead. Stephen sat very still. Reporters later wrote that he seemed almost drained, his shoulders slightly slumped, his jaw set. He did not interrupt, did not speak. When the judge asked the jurors if these were indeed their verdicts on each count, they all answered yes. After the jury left, the judge turned to the two former detectives. He thanked the jurors for their service and set a future date for sentencing. Stephen's attorney asked that his client be released pending appeal, arguing that he had deep community ties and that the case raised serious legal questions. The prosecutor opposed release, stressing the gravity of the convictions and the risk of flight now that life sentences were likely. Judge Weinstein, known for his thoroughness, kept them in custody for the time being. Stephen returned to the detention center, now no longer just an accused man awaiting trial, but a convicted felon waiting to learn whether he would ever again live outside a prison fence. In the months that followed, however, something unusual happened. The defense filed motions asking the judge to set aside the verdict, or at least some of the most serious counts. One of their central arguments was technical but important. They claimed that many of the alleged acts were simply too old to be prosecuted under the normal time limits, and that the government had stretched the law by tying them into a long-running racketeering conspiracy. Judge Weinstein took that challenge seriously. He reviewed years of case law on organized crime prosecutions, statutes of limitation, and how courts had treated similar timelines. He looked closely at when the alleged murders occurred, when the supposed conspiracy began and ended, and how the later Las Vegas conduct fit into the overall pattern. In June 2006, he issued a lengthy written decision that stunned many observers. While he did not declare Stephen innocent, he concluded that a significant portion of the racketeering case, including some of the murders used as key examples, fell outside the allowable time frame under his reading of the law. On that basis, he vacated much of the conviction. He did not simply free the two men without conditions, but he did order their release from jail to strict home confinement while higher courts reviewed his legal conclusions. For Stephen, it must have felt like a sudden breath of air after weeks spent expecting to die behind bars. He was transported back to Las Vegas under supervision, fitted with electronic monitoring, and confined mostly to his home. Reporters appeared on his street again, filming as he walked briefly outside, or as he stepped into a car with marshals. Neighbors who had already been astonished by his arrest now watched as he returned, not fully cleared, but no longer locked in a federal facility. Prosecutors appealed immediately. They said the judge had misapplied the law, that the conspiracy was ongoing into recent years, and that the time limits had been satisfied. They argued that the jury's verdict should stand in full. The case went up to the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, where a panel of judges heard arguments from both sides. Months passed. Stephen lived in a strange limbo, not free in any normal sense, but not in a cell either. He followed the news about his own case, knowing that 3 appellate judges in Manhattan were now debating interpretations of statutes and precedents that would decide his future. He kept largely out of public view, avoiding interviews, seeing only close family, lawyers, and the occasional official visitor. In September 2008, the appeals court issued its ruling. The judges disagreed with Weinstein's reading. They held that the government had properly charged a continuing racketeering enterprise that stretched into the period covered by the statute of limitations. In their view, the later acts, including the Las Vegas drug conduct, tied back convincingly to the older pattern with Casso and Kaplan. As a result, they reinstated the jury's verdict in full and sent the case back down for final sentencing. When federal marshals came again to take Stephen into custody, any temporary sense of reprieve vanished. He was returned to the Metropolitan Detention Center to await the day when the judge, now bound by the appellate decision, would pronounce a definitive sentence. Years earlier, when he first put on a uniform, Stephen had likely watched judges sentence others, burglars, armed robbers, people caught up in street fights that turned deadly, low-level associates of the very mob groups he studied. Now he prepared to stand in front of the bench himself, hearing a number that would not be measured in a handful of years but in the remainder of his natural life. On the morning of sentencing, the courtroom felt different from the busy days of testimony. There were fewer lawyers shuffling boxes, fewer reporters racing in and out. The trial was over. The verdict was in. What remained was something simpler and more final. A judge deciding how much of the rest of a man's life would be spent behind bars. Stephen was brought in wearing prison khaki instead of a suit. The air in the room carried a quiet tension. Families of several people named in the indictment sat in the benches behind the prosecution table, some clutching photos, others just staring straight ahead. On the other side, a small group of Stephen's relatives waited, looking tired from years of hearings and appeals. Judge Jack Weinstein, then in his 80s, took the bench and began to speak in a calm, measured voice. He had presided over many complex cases, drug conspiracies, racketeering, political corruption, but he made it plain that this one stood apart. He spoke about trust, about how people depend on law enforcement officers to safeguard them, and how that trust is a fragile thing. He looked at Stephen and his co-defendant and said that, in his view, their conduct represented some of the most serious wrongdoing he had seen from officers of the law. He talked about how the badge carries unusual power, access to information, authority in the street, the ability to decide when to arrest and when to let someone walk away. He said that when that power is secretly rented out to violent criminals, the damage reaches far beyond individual victims. Whole communities begin to doubt whether the system is truly on their side. Before sentence was imposed, family members of several people killed in the incidents tied to the case were allowed to speak. A mother whose son had been shot after his name surfaced in a police database addressed the court in a steady but strained voice, describing holidays that were no longer the same, an empty chair that never stopped drawing the eye. A relative of a murdered insider described years of not knowing who had set events in motion, of hearing that it was just mob business, and wondering if that meant they were expected to stop asking questions. None of them directed raised voices at Stephen. The emotion was there, but it came out in pauses, in the way they searched for words. They spoke of trust, lost, of feeling as though the very people who had promised to help them had quietly stood on the other side. Stephen's attorney made a final plea for leniency. He acknowledged the verdict, but argued that Stephen was an older man now, that he had family who still relied on him emotionally, that he had also done good work during his long career, solving cases that had brought closure to other families. He asked the court to remember that sentencing is not only about punishment, but also about proportionality and the human being who will live with the result. When it was Stephen's turn to speak, he rose slowly. Those present later recalled that he maintained his innocence, as he had throughout the trial. He said he had never taken money to help a criminal figure, never passed on information for violence, never agreed to murders. He spoke of his years catching trains to Brooklyn precincts before dawn, working late on homicides, sitting with grieving relatives. He said the picture painted of him in court did not match the man he knew himself to be. The judge listened, then turned back to the formal task at hand. Citing the advisory sentencing guidelines and the seriousness of the offenses, he imposed one life term after another, plus additional years, layered so heavily that there was no realistic expectation that Stephen would ever again live outside prison walls. Along with the prison time, the court ordered forfeiture of significant sums alleged to be the proceeds of the corruption, and imposed mandatory assessments on each count. The words, life imprisonment, landed in the hushed room with their own weight. Unlike a term of 10 or 15 years, numbers people can run their minds around, life does not give a clear shape. It means birthdays and holidays passing in institutional hallways, health declining under fluorescent lights, watching the world change through television rather than first-hand experience. After the hearing, marshals led Stephen out a side door, into elevators, through corridors, and eventually back to the detention center, where he waited to be designated to a long-term Bureau of Prisons facility. The journalists outside filed their stories. Headlines again used the phrase that had followed the case from the beginning: Mafia cops sentenced to life. In due course, the federal system assigned Stephen to a high-security penitentiary. He was in his late 60s, an age when many of his former colleagues were years into retirement, traveling, or helping with grandchildren. Instead, he was processed like any other inmate. Fingerprinted again, issued standard clothing, assigned an identification number, and shown to a cell that measured only a few steps across. Life behind bars followed a routine that did not care about his past career. Counts several times a day, set hours for meals, limited recreation, medical appointments, and occasional visits if family could travel. He kept mostly to himself, by most accounts not seeking attention. In interviews, a few people who had crossed his path in custody later said he came across as quiet, polite, and focused on legal papers, always working on motions. Outside the prison fence, lawyers continued to file appeals. After the Second Circuit reinstated the jury's verdict, Stephen's team sought review from the United States Supreme Court. They argued that the way the racketeering conspiracy had been charged and the statute of limitations applied raised important legal questions. In 2010, the court declined to take the case, a unwind order with no explanation, as is typical. With that, the direct appeal process effectively ended. Stephen then turned to post-conviction petitions, asking the trial court to set aside the verdict under special habeas corpus procedures. He claimed ineffective assistance of counsel, challenged aspects of evidence admission, and raised new arguments about how the law had been interpreted. Judge Weinstein, who had once vacated part of the verdict on statute of limitations grounds only to be reversed, now addressed those new motions methodically in written opinions. Each time, he rejected them, concluding that the trial had been fair and that the jury's decision should stand. Through all this, Stephen did not publicly change his position. He continued to insist, through filings and the occasional statement relayed by his attorneys, that he had never been on Casso's payroll, that he had not been involved in the killings attributed to him, and that Kaplan and other cooperators had lied for their own benefit. Outside the legal briefs, the public conversation moved more broadly. Books and long magazine articles examined the case, piecing together the history of the organized crime homicide unit, the relationship between the NYPD and federal agencies, and the personalities inside the department during the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds. Journalists interviewed former officers, prosecutors, and defense lawyers, trying to understand how two detectives could have drifted from hunting mob figures to secretly helping one. Some emphasized the pressures of that era, the constant push to use informants, the unspoken tolerance at times for cutting corners. The way lines between cop and criminal could blur in the minds of people working every day in that shadow world. Others pointed more directly to individual responsibility, arguing that thousands of officers faced the same temptations yet did not cross the boundary Stephen was convicted of crossing. For the NYPD's leadership, the case was a lasting embarrassment. It raised questions about supervision, about internal anti-corruption controls, and about how much one unit should be trusted with, especially sensitive information. In public statements, department officials stressed that the conduct in question was decades old, and that new oversight measures had been put in place since then. Training on ethics and informant handling grew more detailed. Internal affairs units emphasized the need to monitor not only outright bribe-taking, but also unexplained contacts and unusual access to data. None of that reached Stephen directly in his daily reality. The world he now inhabited had its own rules. Keep your head down. Avoid conflicts you can't control. Find ways to pass the long hours. He filed more motions, followed news of his own case when it surfaced, and aged. In the mid-2010 seconds, word began to circulate that his health had deteriorated. Public reporting indicated that he had been diagnosed with advanced cancer, the kind that doesn't leave much room for optimism. His attorneys went back to court, this time not to challenge the conviction itself, but to ask for release on humanitarian grounds. They cited his age, the seriousness of his illness, and the limited time he likely had left. They argued that whatever the court believed about his past, he posed no danger to the public now, and that there was little point in spending his final months in a prison infirmary. The government opposed that request, emphasizing the gravity of the crimes and the need for sentences to mean what they say, especially in cases involving breach of public trust and multiple deaths. Judge Weinstein again weighed the arguments. In the end, he denied the motion for release, concluding that the original reasons for the sentence still carried decisive weight. With his health worsening, Stephen was transferred to a federal medical center run by the Bureau of Prisons, a facility designed to house inmates with serious medical needs. One such complex is in Bootner, North Carolina, and public records show that by the end of his life, Stephen was there, under treatment. The institution provided hospital-style care within a secure perimeter. Doctors and nurses on staff, diagnostic equipment, medications combined with cells, counts, and locked doors. It was a far cry from the Las Vegas streets, where he had once walked his dog under the bright desert sky, or from the Brooklyn squad rooms, where organized crime charts once lined the walls. Days in a medical facility are measured not by big events but by small routines. Vital signs taken, medications dispensed, quiet conversations with chaplains or counselors, occasional letters from outside. On the 8th of April 2017, at age 75, Stephen Louis Caracappa died in federal custody. Official records did not dwell on cause of death beyond noting illness, but news coverage, drawing on his lawyers and family, mentioned cancer. There was no public funeral keyed to his criminal case, no statement of remorse issued in his name. His passing was marked mostly in short pieces, noting that one of the two men once dubbed mafia cops had died behind bars. For families of the victims whose names had been read out over the years, men kidnapped off the street, shot in cars, tracked to new lives in distant states, the news landed in different ways. Some said it brought a sense of closure, not in the sense of joy, but as the final line in a long, painful chapter. Others felt that no sentence, no death in prison, could truly balance the losses they had endured decades earlier. Among former colleagues in law enforcement, reactions were mixed and often complex. Some who had worked alongside Stephen in the organized crime homicide unit said they still struggled to reconcile the quiet, methodical detective they remembered with the portrait painted at trial. Others were blunt, saying that if the jury had it right, then he had betrayed not only the public but also every officer who had risked a career and personal safety to stand up against organized crime. Within academic and policy circles, the case remained a cautionary example. It appeared in discussions about how to guard against inside corruption, how to design systems so that no single officer or pair of officers could access so much sensitive information without checks, and how to protect informant identities when even specialized units might be compromised. Some reform advocates pointed out that the case showed internal oversight must be constant, not just a reaction to scandals. In quieter corners, people also wondered about the more human side of his story. How does someone who begins a career in uniform learning procedures, writing reports, attending roll call, end up on the other side of the law? There is no single answer. In Stephen's case, the record shows a combination of opportunity, access, long exposure to criminal networks, and the lure of money and influence. Whether greed, a sense of being underappreciated, or something more complicated drove him, only he fully knew. What remains clear from official records, court transcripts, and the final outcome is this. A boy from Brooklyn grew into a detective chosen for one of the most sensitive units in New York City, then, according to a jury and multiple appellate courts, chose to sell that position to a violent underboss for years. That choice helped shape a series of violent acts that rippled outward through families and neighborhoods. It eventually brought him, decades later, to a steel door closing in a federal medical center, where he left this world under the same government custody that he had once represented with a badge on his belt. For all the dramatic headlines and talk show summaries, the lasting impact of Stephen's life lies less in the label mafia cop and more in the quieter lessons his story offers. How important oversight is, how dangerous it can be when a person with great authority answers in secret to someone outside the law, and how long the consequences of such decisions can echo, far beyond the years when the choices were first made. When news of Stephen's death filtered out the brief wire copy noting that he had died in federal custody at 75, it landed in scattered pockets of memory across the country. In Brooklyn, a woman in late middle age, long moved to a quieter neighborhood, read the line twice. Her son had vanished decades earlier, in the mid-1980 seconds. He was a diamond dealer named Israel Greenwald, a man who commuted into the city each day and came home late but reliably. One morning he left for work and never returned. For years his family searched, put up posters, pressed the police for answers. The case went cold, filed away as just another missing person in a city with too many mysteries. Only much later, after Anthony Casso began talking, and after new investigators pored over old accounts, did the full story start to emerge. According to federal testimony and civil court filings, Casso suspected Greenwald of cooperating with law enforcement in a separate fraud probe. He ordered that Greenwald be taken and killed. Burial followed not in some distant field, but under a Brooklyn auto shop, where a pit was dug in the concrete and then covered, leaving no outward sign. In 2005, almost 2 decades after Greenwald vanished, his remains were finally recovered from beneath that garage floor. The excavation was methodical, done under official supervision, and when investigators matched what they found with dental records and other evidence, they confirmed what his family had feared for years but had never been able to prove. He had not walked away, had not started a new life. He had been killed and hidden. As more documents surfaced, including Casso's statements and Burton Kaplan's detailed recollections, Greenwald's relatives learned that Stephen and his partner had allegedly played a part, providing information that helped Casso identify and target him. The degree of direct involvement was argued over in courtrooms, but the family's view hardened. Officers who were supposed to protect people like Israel had, in their eyes, helped deliver him into danger. They sued the city, accusing the NYPD of failing to stop 2 detectives who were, according to federal courts, secretly working for a mob underboss. The case wound through the civil system for years, with disputes over records, responsibility, and damages. For the Greenwalds, no amount of money could bring back a husband and father, or erase the long stretch of not knowing. What mattered more was acknowledgement that what had happened to him was not an unlucky encounter with faceless criminals, but the result, at least in part, of a betrayal inside the very agency they had turned to for help when he disappeared. In another Brooklyn apartment, a different family had wrestled with something equally heavy. On Christmas Day 1986, their son, a young man named Nicholas Guido, had been sitting in a car outside a relative's home when gunfire ripped through the quiet. He died almost instantly. Early whispers said it was mob-related, that he might have been caught in a feud. His family, stunned, insisted he had no such ties. He was, they said, simply a neighborhood kid with an ordinary job who loved holiday gatherings. They lived for years with half-answers. Yes, the killing looked like a planned hit. No, the police could not explain why he was targeted. Only later, As federal authorities laid out the Mafia Cops case, did the terrible explanation come into focus. The wrong Nicholas Guido's information had been pulled from a police database by Stephen, passed on through Kaplan, and fed to Casso's shooters. The man Casso wanted was a different individual with the same name. A confirmatory step that should have been taken never was. An innocent person was killed because a corrupted detective, working for a violent underboss, had treated a law of enforcement search as a favor in a criminal vendetta. When that piece of the story emerged at trial, Guido's family learned that their long insistence that Nicholas had not been secretly involved in mob life had been right all along. He had been a victim not of his own choices, but of a name match and the misuse of confidential tools. Families of other victims, men like James Heidel, Bruno Facciola, and Anthony DeLappy, had their own bitter discoveries. Heidel's mother, who had watched her son vanish one night from near her home, heard for the first time in federal court how his license plate and address had been obtained from NYPD systems and shared with the man who wanted her son dead. DeLappy's relatives learned that his decision to move clear across the country, to Los Angeles, and to live under his own name there, had not been enough because an insider with access to national databases had quietly traced him. For these families, Stephen's death in custody did not erase the decades of grief, nor did it answer the lingering personal questions that official transcripts never quite cover. They were left with a set of facts. A detective sworn to uphold the law had, according to juries and appellate judges, chosen on multiple occasions to help men who were planning or carrying out lethal attacks. Inside law enforcement circles, Stephen's story continued to be dissected. One of the key figures in developing the case had been William Oldham, himself a former NYPD detective who later worked with the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office and then with federal prosecutors. Oldham had spent years poring through old homicide files, tracking inconsistencies, and following faint hints that pointed again and again toward the same two names. It was Oldham who helped connect Kaplan's debriefings to specific cases, who understood enough about how the old organized crime homicide unit functioned to spot unusual patterns. He knew, for example, which detectives had legitimate reasons to access certain files and which did not, which phone calls or meetings fit normal investigative work, and which seemed out of place. Working with prosecutors, he helped build the scaffolding that transformed rumors into an indictment. After the trial, Oldham co-wrote a book titled The Brotherhoods, detailing the long road from suspicion to conviction. He described not only the corruption, but also the institutional context, the era when the unit was formed, the culture inside certain squads, the internal rivalries that sometimes made information sharing difficult. Through his account, readers got a clearer sense of how Stephen's double life had slipped through the cracks for so long, a combination of his quiet personality, a reverence for specialized units, and the difficulty of challenging colleagues based on incomplete suspicions. Beyond books, the case became a standard reference point in law schools and police academies. Law students studying racketeering statutes read opinions in United States v. Eppolito and Caracappa to see how courts interpret long-running conspiracies and apply statutes of limitation when alleged conduct straddles decades. Trainee officers heard abbreviated versions of the story in ethics classes, using it as a warning about the slippery nature of small compromises and the importance of resisting entanglements with informants that cross into friendship or financial dependency. Internal investigators pointed to specific lessons. Never let one or two detectives control all access to a sensitive database. Design systems so that every query is logged and periodically audited. Create channels for officers to report concerns about colleagues without fear of automatic retaliation. The NYPD had already been through major corruption reckonings before the Knapp Commission in the 1972nd, the Mullen Commission in the early 1992nd. Those inquiries focused on payoffs from drug dealers, theft during raids, and patterns of street-level abuse. Stephen's case added something more specialized. The danger that can arise when elite units, entrusted with high understakes cases and complex informant networks, operate with minimal day-to-day oversight. At the same time, some retired officers, especially those who had known Stephen personally, struggled with the narrative. They remembered a man who worked long hours, who absorbed grim details without complaint, who could sit for hours with wiretap logs and case charts. A few told reporters they found it hard to square that image with the idea of a detective taking cash envelopes from a vicious underboss. They conceded the jury's verdict, but admitted, when pressed, that part of them still wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding. Others had little patience for such doubts. They pointed out that the records were now extensive. Sworn testimony from multiple independent witnesses, detailed financial flows, corroborated timelines, undercover recordings from years later. For those officers, the evidence showed that Stephen had not stumbled accidentally into misconduct, but had made a series of deliberate choices over years, each one taking him further from the oath he had taken as a young man. The story also sparked debate about the use of cooperating witnesses like Casso and Kaplan themselves. Some critics argued that building a case so heavily on the words of criminals seeking lighter sentences risked distortion. Supporters countered that in conspiracies built on secrecy and fear, there is often no other way to reconstruct events from decades earlier, except through insiders, especially when their accounts can be cross-checked against documents and independent facts. Stephen's partner, Louis Eppolito, followed a parallel path after conviction. A one-time author of an autobiography titled Mafia Cop, a book that had presented his family background and career in a dramatically different light, he too received a life sentence. He remained in federal custody until his death in 2019, also in a prison medical facility. Together, their names came to represent a specific kind of breach, not the casual shakedown of a corner dealer, but the systematic selling of high-level law enforcement secrets to a powerful criminal organization. For Stephen's own family, the decades brought a different kind of weight. Public records show that he had a wife and children, people who, when the story broke, faced a wave of attention they had never sought. Reporters called, neighbors whispered, even distant acquaintances reached out wanting to know if the allegations could really be true. They had known him as a husband, a father, a provider, not as a headline or a case study. Some stood by his claims of innocence, pointing to the years when he had brought home a steady paycheck, the absence of flashy spending, the lack of obvious signs that he was receiving illicit payments. Families of those convicted of serious crimes often occupy a difficult middle ground. They are not responsible for the acts attributed to their relative, yet they feel the social consequences acutely. In Stephen's case, that meant years of visiting rooms, security checks, and phone calls that ended when the line automatically cut off after its allotted time. The prison system, for its part, treated him in many ways like any other inmate, but his history as a former officer always hovered in the background. Ex-law enforcement prisoners are usually housed with particular care to avoid conflicts with those they once might have helped arrest or whose friends they helped send away. Staff placed him in units where the risk of direct retaliation was lower, another small irony in a life where he had once been accused of helping target people in environments they thought were safe. As the years after his death passed, public attention drifted. New scandals, new cases, new names filled headlines. Yet the outline of Stephen's story remained in the background of discussions about policing, particularly in New York. When commentators talked about transparency in specialized units, his case was sometimes mentioned. When departments invested in new tracking systems for database access, internal presentations occasionally cited the dangers illustrated by the mafia cops. In classrooms and training seminars, instructors returned not only to the sensational elements, the mob boss, the cash payments, the 8 homicides listed in indictments, but also to the more subtle early steps. They asked trainees to imagine the first moment Stephen accepted a favor he knew he should decline, perhaps a free meal, a cash gift framed as a thank you, a request to run a license plate off the record. They underscored how, once that line is crossed, it becomes harder and harder to pull back. Each small compromise can make the next one seem less dramatic, until a person wakes up far from the values they thought they held. Stephen's case also highlighted the importance of keeping accurate, retrievable records. Without old computer logs, phone data, and archived reports, it would have been much more difficult years later to test the truth of Kaplan's stories. The fact that investigators could compare his recollections to objective traces, dates of database access, travel records, timelines of killings, made it possible to separate mere accusation from patterns that persuaded a jury. From a distance, looking at the arc of Stephen's life, you can mark the key inflection points. Growing up in Brooklyn, at a time when organized crime had visible street-level presence, choosing the police academy over other paths, rising into elite homicide work, meeting and bonding with a colleague from a family deeply entangled with the underworld, accepting that first payment from an intermediary like Kaplan, getting used to the flow of extra cash, watching as people whose names he had looked up turned up dead, retiring under a cloud of unproven rumor, trying to build a quiet life in Las Vegas, being pulled back into criminal opportunity through a supposed drug trafficker, and finally, being arrested, tried, convicted, and spending his last years in custody. Each step, viewed in isolation, might have seemed manageable to the person taking it, but laid out end to end, they formed a chain that carried him from the role of protector to that of convicted conspirator in multiple killings. That long chain, and the human costs attached to it, would continue to be studied, talked about, and remembered long after the man at the center of it took his last breath in a prison hospital bed. Years after Stephen died in that federal medical center, his name still surfaced in places he would never see. Not in headlines as often anymore, but in quieter rooms, lecture halls, training academies, internal briefings. In one such room, a group of young recruits sat in neat rows, notebooks out, the hum of the projector filling a brief silence, while an instructor loaded a slide. The slide did not show grisly crime scene images or a dramatic arrest photo. Instead, it showed a simple black and white portrait, a middle-aged man in a plain shirt and tie, calm expression, the faintest hint of a weary half-smile. Underneath the picture were just 3 lines. Stephen Louis Caracappa, NYPD detective, organized crime homicide, convicted 2006, died in federal custody 2017. The instructor, a veteran internal affairs supervisor, didn't start with the sensational parts. He spoke instead about trust, how people call the police at their worst moments, how specialized units, especially those dealing with organized crime, hold information that can mean life or death for witnesses, informants, and suspects alike, how every decision an officer makes around that information matters. Then he told them about Stephen. He walked them through the broad strokes they already vaguely knew. That Stephen had grown up in Brooklyn, joined the police force during a difficult era, and climbed into a homicide squad tasked specifically with killings linked to long-standing criminal organizations. That from that position, according to federal courts and a jury's decision, he began to sell information to a violent underworld boss, that people whose names came up in his searches later turned up dead or disappeared. That he retired, moved west, and was eventually arrested and convicted as part of a long conspiracy that stretched across 2 decades. He didn't dwell on each killing. The recruits would read about those later if they wanted. Instead, he focused on the first step. People always ask, how could someone go that far? He said, resting a hand on the podium. The better question is, how did he start? Because you don't wake up one morning and suddenly agree to help someone hunt down a target. You get there, little by little. He described a pattern investigators had pieced together from informant testimony and old records. The first confidential plate check done as a favor for a so-called friend of a friend. The first envelope of cash framed as a small thank you for helping with a problem. The rationalizations that might have followed. I'm not the one pulling the trigger. They'll find this guy some other way anyway. Everybody bends the rules sometimes. Bit by bit, the line between legitimate work and what Stephen was eventually convicted of doing blurred. By the time he was allegedly confirming the suspicion that certain insiders were speaking with law enforcement or tracking people who'd moved across the country, the early hesitation had probably faded. What had once felt like a major leap came to seem, to him, like another errand. The recruits listened, some scribbling, some just watching the photo on the screen. For them, Stephen was not a headline from their past. Most had been children when he went on trial. To them, he was almost like a character in a cautionary tale, except that the tale was documented in court transcripts and appeals decisions, not in fiction. Outside of classrooms, the full story remained more complicated than any single lesson. Some people still argued over parts of it. A minority of writers and commentators took a skeptical view of the prosecution, pointing to the heavy reliance on cooperators. They noted that Casso was known for lies and manipulation, and that Kaplan, while meticulous, was a convicted trafficker who had something to gain from sharing his story. They asked whether the evidence would have been as persuasive without those insiders. Yet when you looked at the official record, the broad outlines stood firm. A federal jury had weighed weeks of testimony and records. A longtime trial judge had overseen the proceedings, set aside part of the verdict on technical grounds, and then been overruled by a higher court that reinstated the convictions. The Supreme Court had declined to take up further appeals. Even after multiple post-trial motions, the results had stayed in place. In the eyes of the legal system, the matter was settled. More than a decade after sentencing, you could still find Stephen's name in casebooks under discussions of racketeering, United States versus Lashin. Eppolito and Caracappa became a leading example of how courts handle long-running conspiracies that begin with one set of crimes and later include very different ones. The early years of cooperation with Casso and the later drug-related sting in Las Vegas. In those pages, the focus was dry. Dates, statutes, interpretations of pattern, enterprise, and continuing offense. Yet behind each line of legal reasoning sat human choices. A detective deciding to log into a database. A middleman choosing to walk into a diner and slide a slip of paper across the table. A mob leader nodding, then sending word down through his people. A target getting into a car, unaware that his address had been shared days earlier by someone sitting at a government desk. The NYPD itself carried those lessons forward in very practical ways. Data access systems were upgraded not only for speed, but for accountability. Every query left a trail: who ran it, when, from which terminal, for what stated purpose. Supervisors could run audits, looking for unusual patterns. A detective repeatedly checking information on people outside his caseload, or accessing records connected to acquaintances. The idea was not that these flags automatically proved wrongdoing, but that they triggered questions early, not decades later. Training around informants also became more structured. New officers learned not just the mechanics of debriefing and documenting sources, but also the emotional risks. Informants often try to build a sense of camaraderie, to offer gifts, to blur professional distance. In the era when Stephen came up, those dynamics existed, but were less openly discussed. His case, and others like it, pushed departments to say openly, "You must keep a boundary. When you feel tempted to step over it, you must tell someone, not hide it." In communities that had lived under the shadow of organized crime, the story took on yet another flavor. Residents of certain Brooklyn neighborhoods remembered the years when mob figures seemed to walk openly, when extortion and loan sharking were facts of life. For them, the revelation that a detective in a specialized homicide unit had been working for a boss like Casso felt both shocking and, in a strange way, unsurprising. They had long suspected that some uniformed officers looked the other way or quietly passed word about raids. Seeing it confirmed at such a high level reinforced their cynicism. At the same time, other detectives and federal agents had spent those same years risking careers and safety to push back against that culture. They sat through endless wiretaps, convinced reluctant witnesses to testify, navigated political pressure, and built the very cases that would eventually expose someone like Stephen. For them, his conviction was bittersweet, proof that the system could correct itself, but also confirmation that rot had been deeper than many wanted to believe. Around kitchen tables, older officers told younger ones what it had felt like from inside back then. How the pressure to deliver results mixed with a sometimes loose attitude towards small favors. How the line, "everybody does it," could justify behaviors that, when dragged into daylight decades later, looked very different. Stephen's name came up in those stories not as a cartoon villain, but as a stark example of where that attitude could lead. His story also invited reflection on memory and denial. Some people who had known him swore until their own last days that he could not have done what prosecutors described. They pointed to moments of decency they had witnessed, times he had shown kindness to victims' families, or gone the extra mile on a case that had no connection to organized crime. For them, holding both images at once, the diligent detective and the man convicted of selling information, was almost impossible. So they chose one. Others, including some who had worked in nearby units, admitted in hindsight that there had been small signs that unsettled them. Casual mentions of certain names with an odd tone. A sense that Stephen and his partner seemed to have more detailed knowledge of mob inner workings than could be entirely explained by wiretaps and standard legwork. But they had never pulled those threads, either out of respect, fear of being seen as disloyal, or simply because they lacked hard proof. Looking back, investigators who later reconstructed the case spoke openly about how complicated such suspicions could be. In any large institution, especially one that prizes unity in the face of danger, challenging a respected colleague is not easy. The risk of being wrong and of damaging someone's reputation without cause feels tremendous. Yet Stephen's case showed the cost of saying nothing when scattered worries add up to something larger. In a broader culture fascinated by crime stories, Stephen's life became raw material for documentaries, podcasts, and dramatizations. Scriptwriters pitched series based loosely on the cop who crossed sides. Some productions emphasized the lurid aspects, the mob meetings, the envelopes of cash, the highway shootings. Others tried to stay closer to the documented record, interviewing retired detectives, prosecutors, and even defense attorneys to give a fuller view. Those who had lived through the real events approached such projects cautiously. For them, these were not simply thrilling plots. They were tied to very real pain. A mother answering a knock to find officers on her steps, relatives sitting in court listening to their loved one's last day described in technical detail, officers grappling with the knowledge that a colleague had used their shared badge to further harm. Amid all the retellings, one image lingered more quietly. Stephen in his Las Vegas neighborhood, before everything unraveled. A man in late middle age, watering a small patch of lawn under the desert Sunday, a dog trotting at his side, a wave to a neighbor pulling into a driveway. From the outside, nothing to suggest the layers beneath. It's tempting to look at that picture and say everything caught up with him in the end, that justice, however delayed, arrived. And in a narrow legal sense, it did. He was investigated, charged, tried, convicted, sentenced, and he died under the authority of the same government he had once represented. But the full story resists such simple closure. Justice, in the larger sense, would have meant that those first steps across the line were spotted and stopped early, that license plates run for private favors were flagged, that informants bragging about cops on the payroll triggered urgent internal probes, that colleagues who felt something was off had channels to speak up and reason to believe they would be taken seriously. It would have meant that men like Israel Greenwald and the wrong Nicholas Guido came home on the nights they were attacked. Nothing in the final ledger can give those nights back. What remains are records and lessons. Records in the form of court transcripts, investigative reports, appeals opinions, and archived news stories, preserving in dry language the contours of Stephen's choices and their consequences. Lessons in the form of policies, ethical teachings, cautionary tales told to new officers and prosecutors about the slow slide from expediency into corruption. In the end, Stephen's life offers a kind of mirror. It reflects how powerful a badge can be, not only in the hands of those who honor it, but also in the rare, damaging hands of those who betray it. It shows how the fight against organized crime, with its constant proximity to people who deal in threats and money, can distort the judgment of those who aren't vigilant with themselves. And it underlines that accountability in public institutions often moves slowly, but can, over time, uncover truths that seemed buried. Somewhere, a young recruit in that training room lowered their pen as the instructor clicked to the next slide, moving on to another case, another set of names. The photo of Stephen disappeared from the screen, but not from the lesson. Long after he was gone, the story of the detective who turned toward the very people he was sworn to pursue remained, carried forward in policy manuals, whispered warnings, and the quiet resolve of those determined not to follow the same path. And far from that classroom, in the streets where these events first unfolded, life continued. Children walked past buildings that once housed clandestine meetings. New families moved into apartments where old players had lived. Businesses changed hands. Most people there never thought about Stephen at all. Yet the safeguards shaped in part by his downfall, better records, tighter oversight, more honest talk about ethical risks, touched their lives in ways they might never notice. So his story, with all its turns from Brooklyn to the squad room, from backroom deals to a desert retirement, from a guarded courtroom to a prison hospital bed, settled into history. Not as a tale of inevitable fate, but as a long chain of decisions, each one made by a man who once swore an oath to protect others, and who, in the judgment of the law and of many who knew the facts, broke that oath again and again until there was no road back.